Hi, I'd like to welcome you to a discussion of American relations with Iran. From a time when there were virtually no significant relations in the 1930s to a period in the 1940s when there were good working relationships, to finally where the United States will break its promises regarding Iran and overthrow a democratically elected government, which has had long-lasting implications since then. I'd like to begin by talking about Reza Pahlavi, who was the Shah at the time. By the 1930s, he had taken over in a coup in 1921 with the help of some of the military. He had overthrown the Qajar dynasty. He had attempted to westernize Iran, much like Mustafa Kemal had in Turkey. And in the 1930s, he and his regime took a strong interest in Nazi Germany. Now, we have to be careful when we say that, because we know now, of course, about the Holocaust and the terrible things that Adolf Hitler and his regime did. But there wasn't any Holocaust yet in the 1930s, and many were convinced, not just in Iran but in other parts of the world, that democracy was on its way out, that totalitarian systems were the wave of the future. And Nazi Germany appeared to be efficient and effective. Further, from Reza Pahlavi's point of view and his advisors, Nazi Germany believed in Aryan, A-R-Y-A-N, supremacy. Well, the Iranians regarded themselves as Aryan, and in fact, as part of that, Reza Pahlavi renamed the country from Persia to Iran, which derives from the word Aryan. Following through on this commitment and name change, he invited large numbers of government technicians to come to Iran in the 1930s in growing numbers. He reorientated Iran's foreign trade to where Iran went from virtually no significant trade to Germany to by the outbreak of World War II in 1939, 41% of their foreign trade was with Nazi Germany. You would find your first significant persecution of the Baha'i during this time period and other minorities. You would also find that the Boy Scouts of Iran were organized more along the lines of the Hitler Youth. So this was a serious reorientation of Iran. And it stayed that way as World War II began. And the crunch came when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Iran, as you may know, borders upon what was the Soviet Union. And Iran became of crucial strategic interest to the United States and the British. Why? Because it was the only all-weather route to get Lend-Lease supplies through to the Soviet Union once the Soviets had been attacked in June of 1941. So important was Iran, in fact, for this purpose, that the Brits and the Soviets gave an ultimatum to the Iranian government, an ultimatum that they must allow Lend-Lease to come through to the Soviets. Reza Pahlavi refused, probably thinking Germany was going to win the war. Well, the almost immediate consequence was the Soviets sent in significant numbers of troops from the north, established a strong sphere of influence, built up a communist party, the Tudeh Party, T-U-D-E-H, meaning masses. The British established a strong sphere of influence in the south. And once the United States came into the war, after Pearl Harbor, the United States sent a military contingent there too to help facilitate the trade of Lend-Lease coming through. So all three of these great powers had significant relations with Iran at this point. Franklin Roosevelt met with Stalin and Churchill in Tehran, in fact, in 1943. And while their focus, of course, was the war, at the same token, Roosevelt extracted a promise from the Soviets and the British that they would, along with the United States, respect the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of Iran. In other words, that they wouldn't carve it up during or after the war. And this led to good relations with the United States. But in the meantime, the Soviets and the British, when they sent their troops in, overthrew Reza Pahlavi's regime and replaced him with his 20-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And this Shah was to be of great importance in Iran's history. Well, once he takes over and the war ends, the Soviets are squeezed out under American pressure and British pressure, and from the Iranian government. The Iranian even snookered them. They made them an agreement where, in exchange for some oil, the Soviets would leave. Once the Soviets left, Iran reneged on the deal. Well, the new government under Pahlavi worked out trade relations with the United States, and significant aid began to go to Iran. Along with that, a training mission for the military and police, led by a General Schwarzkopf, father of Norman Schwarzkopf, to be famous in Gulf War of 1991. Under these conditions, things worked rather well, until the time that there was a democratic election and the new Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadeq, gained power in 1951. He wanted to renegotiate the terms of oil agreement with the British. Iran only got 20% of the revenues, quite different than Saudi Arabia, which got 50%, or Venezuela, which got 50%. He wanted to get a better deal. The British refused, so he promptly nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, took it over, and threw the British technicians out of the country. Well, the Brits, of course, didn't like this much at all, and began to organize opposition within Iran to Mossadeq. He was very clever, though, and was able to hold off these efforts until Eisenhower became president, and then Mossadeq made a fateful offer. He offered to Eisenhower's administration that if the United States would help them, then this would make sure that communism would not advance within Iran, taking advantage, he thought, of the Cold War. Well, this had the exact opposite effect of what he intended. This led the United States to become convinced that he was too cozy with the communists. After all, he did work to some degree with the Communist Party in Iran. He was a nationalist after all, and he had nationalized oil, which made him look like, to the United States' eyes, a communist, especially influenced by British propaganda. And so the American CIA worked with the British Secret Service to overthrow Mossadeq in 1953, even though he had been a democratically elected government, proving that the United States preferred stability to democracy in this case, which was to have fateful consequences later. And I will take you to that later story in another talk. I hope you enjoyed this. So please come to my blog at historybehindthenews.com.